Well, thank you for inviting me. I'd like to have come up there, but that's not possible, unfortunately. So this is the next best thing. But yeah, it's nice to talk to clubs because clubs have always been one of the mainstays of ham radio. That's how I got into ham radio, through joining a radio club. And I think it's a shame really that the club, some of the clubs are having problems in getting the attendance. But you know, that's the way that life goes these days. And of course, the average age of the ham radio operator seems to be getting older and older, so that in itself presents a problem. But anyway, I'm going to talk about HF operation from a small garden. I'll give you my experience and my advice, and hopefully we can come up with some useful information for you. Just a bit of background. I was licensed back in 1960 when I was 17 years old, just left school. And I started life in insurance, and I was a insurance fire surveyor until the age of 30. And then I decided that I'd had enough of that. Although I enjoyed it, I was really interested in radio. And so I opened a small shop in Hockley in 1973, September 1973. And previously I'd been selling mini products, antennas, for about 3 or 4 months from home, and I was quite pleased with the way that was going. But it was still a big step for me because I had 2 young children and a mortgage, and I gave up quite a good job in London to start up a shop in Hockley. Well, obviously I survived that, so that proved to be quite a useful. Sorry, I'm just getting my thing out. Right, so what is a small garden? Well, I reckon a small garden is the one that's not big enough for you. I think we've all got some ideas of what gardens should be like. And when I was first licensed, we always yearned for a garden that was 132 foot long, and it could be a foot wide. And the reason for that was that a quarter wave on 160 meters was 132 foot. And 160 meters was the band that we all cut our teeth on in those days. And so 132 foot was desirable. And in actual fact, gardens in those days were actually not bad size. I actually looked up the garden of G3OJV, who used to live in Chelmsford. And I've got a call book, and I found his address in Chelmsford, where he used to live. And lo and behold, his garden was about 102 foot long. And so his 102 foot G3OJV fitted into his garden quite nicely. So that was an interesting thing to find. Now, I think that if you've got a small garden, you need to have a state of mind that you really need to have confidence that you can do something with it. You know, small gardens can be 30 foot long, maybe a bit shorter, and wide, well, 30 foot, 28 foot wide. So they are a bit of a challenge, but I think that's really part and parcel of ham radio. Ham radio started off as a means of experimenting. Really, that's what it was really aimed at. And I think we've tried to carry that forward a bit. And I think if you've got a small garden, then you just treat it as a bit of a challenge. You know, ham radio, we experiment, we try this and we try that, and by and large we get some enjoyment out of it. Of course, very often things don't quite work out as we hoped, but you know, that is ham radio for you. I think that you need to not to aim too highly. You know, if you're starting out in ham radio, or you've been going for some while, you don't want to set your sights too high. It's very easy to think, oh, Joe down the road has got a 3-element Yargin, he's got a half acre of ground, and he's got, you know, 400 watts or a kilowatt now probably of power. And it's very easy to get despondent. But I think that is the wrong attitude, really, because as much as you may yearn for that, he's got to worry about when it's windy and so forth. I operated a high power station in America over a period of about a week or so, a week and a half, and the massive grade aerials, kilowatt on each band. And for the first couple of evenings, fascinating. But as the time went on, I didn't really get the yearn to go on that much because I could work anything I heard. There was no challenge at all. You know, if I heard a station, I could work him. So I think that to some extent, although you may think that you know, you're disadvantaged, if you've got a big station, there comes a time, I think, when there is no challenge. You can work anything that you want to. So I think treat it as a challenge, and don't judge antennas too quickly. You know, if you erect a new antenna, two things will happen. It's either the best antenna you've ever erected, or it's the worst antenna you've ever erected. It's the best antenna because conditions happen to be super good on that evening, or it's the worst antenna because conditions were absolutely awful that evening. And the only way to judge an antenna really is to give it some time. Give it. Well, I'm going to say give it several weeks at least, unless of course you know that you know things it's just not working at all. But don't prejudge an antenna on just a couple of evenings operation. And I think also VSWR. I did a video on that recently. Get real. You know, we can get tied up with VSWRs. My VSWR is 1.5 and I can't get it any lower. Well, the reason you can't get it any lower is because it's not possible to get it any lower. And whether it's 1.5 or 2 really doesn't make a heap of the difference in terms of your signal. And even 2.5, even 3 to 1, provided that your transceiver can match it, and most transceivers have got internal ATUs now, or antenna matching units, then there's not a problem. I'm not saying don't strive for a low VSWR because you want to get low VSWR to get maximum bandwidth. But it's not sort of sacrosanct. It's if you can't get it down, accept it for what it is. Antenna theory. You know, antenna theory is fascinating. You can read the books on it and so forth. And sometimes you can read too much into it. You think, well, if I have a dipole, it's got to be halfway above the ground. Well, the reason it's got to be halfway above the ground is because it works pretty well at halfway above the ground. But it doesn't mean to say that it's got to be a half-wave above the ground, because if you can't get it half-wave above the ground, well, you get it as high as you can. And I've seen so much really about antenna theory and people saying, well, it's not going to work because this, because that. If you read too much antenna theory, you can get yourself tied up. And, you know, sometimes the only way to get things working or to try things is to actually try things. Don't be frightened of trying something. You know, every antenna works. There's not such a thing as an antenna that doesn't work, but some work better than others. You know, somebody said, well, you can put a 6-inch nail in the back of the transceiver. Well, I wouldn't advise it. But it takes the point that every antenna will radiate. Now, I did a video recently about low dipoles. Dipole is a good antenna to start with. Half-wave dipole, it's a classic antenna. In fact, a high proportion of antennas are variations of the dipole. You can actually get some good signals from a low dipole. I erected a 40-meter dipole in my garden about a year ago, and it was about 8 foot above the ground. It was just strung through some shrubs, and I was quite amazed at what I was working on this dipole. It was working extremely well. I remember having a contact with a station up in where was it, in north of Scotland, and he gave me 5 and 9 plus, and I thought, well, he's exaggerating, but no, it was 5 and 9 plus, and it was well, it wasn't high angle radiation. It was I think it was probably 40 or 50 degrees, but it worked extremely well. Now that antenna was actually invisible. And when I first tried it, previous nights, I thought, well, I don't know, it's not going to work. I'm not hearing that much. And it's just psychologically an aerial sort of 8 foot above the ground in the shrubs. It's not going to work, you know, because you're programmed to think it's not going to work. And yet the following night, I was quite amazed on 40 meters. And that was one of the first things that I noticed or learnt, that all aerials can work to some way or other. You know, if you have a low area on 40 meters, you get high angle radiation, but high angle radiation very often can produce some very, very good QSOs. 40 meters very often is short skip. And for short skip, high angle radiation is great. So don't be worried about the height of the antenna. Yes, get it as high as you can, but it doesn't have to be half wave above the ground. You know, even if you've really got a small garden, you could actually put a mobile whip in the garden with some radials and load it up. You'd probably get a reasonable match and it would work. The problem with a mobile antenna is it's very short, and any short antenna has got a narrow bandwidth. So it does mean to say that whilst it will work, the VSWR will rise either side, and therefore you'd have to sort of tune it for a particular part of the band, particularly if you're talking about the lower bands. I mean, on 10 meters, you can always have a full size vertical anyway. But verticals work quite well. I'll come back to that in a minute. The verticals work quite well, but there are some limitations. But you could put a mobile whip in the garden, load it up, and I guarantee that you get some contacts on it. Right. One of the most popular antennas at the moment is the end-fed half wave. The end-fed Y used to be the mainstay of many stations back when I was first licensed in 1960. And then it lost its popularity. It became known as the antenna that caused interference, the antenna that was noisy, it wasn't a good idea, you need a counterpoise, etc., etc. It had really bad press, and it fell out of favour for quite a few years. And even the RSGB in one of their publications said that it's not a good idea. It's a noisy aerial. Don't put it up. It'll cause interference, etc., etc. And this is one of the things that's been passed down. Now, of course, going back in those days when we had TV on the 45 megahertz or whatever it wasn't too difficult to wipe the screen out. The problem with some of these end-fed wires, of course, they came straight into the shack. They were radiating right at the point where they left the transmitter or transceiver, and it was quite understandable they probably did cause interference. Did they pick up noise? I don't know, but it had the reputation of being noisy. Well, I guess around about 15 years ago, the 49-to-1 UNUN became available, or became a popular transformer. And this was used to feed an end-fed wire. Now, an end-fed wire has a particular advantage. It's resonant, it's got the same impedance at the end on harmonic frequencies. If you have a centre-fed dipole, as soon as you try to feed it on the second harmonic, it's lost it. The impedance is sky high. The advantage of an end-fed half wave is that it always has a high impedance on all the harmonics. So the 7 megahertz antenna will have a high impedance, and on 20 meters it'll have the same high impedance. It'll have the same high impedance on 15 and same high impedance on 10 meters. That means to say that you've got a constant impedance, which means to say that if you can find a way of matching that antenna, matching that high impedance, then you've got a multi-band antenna. Of course, the 49-to-1 UNUN came along, which matched quite well the high impedance of the antenna. And it meant to say that you could just run out a length of wire and get multi-band operation. Now, in my experience over the last few years, I found that the end-fed wire is very versatile. It doesn't have a high noise, it doesn't cause interference, and it seems to be very tolerant of being bent around a garden. And a number of stations I've worked where they've been using an end-fed half wave but bent around the garden, and I've done it myself, and it doesn't seem to upset it too much. You will find that you may need to adjust the length of it for the resonance. Generally speaking, an end-fed half wave is slightly shorter than a normal half wave, and that's because the transformer at the end tends to load the antenna. So if you're going to put up a end-fed half wave, if you cut it to a half wave long, you'll probably find you need to trim it back a bit. But common sense says make it a bit longer anyway, and then cut it back. What about a counterpoise? Well, a lot of people say an end-fed half wave won't work unless you have a counterpoise. Well, That's not true. Les Moxon came up with the principle of using an end-fed wire and said that you only need a 0.05 of a wavelength of counterpoise, and that, of course, can be easily provided by the coax feeder anyway. I've never found that adding a counterpoise has any effect at all, and I've often used end-fed half waves from the back of the house where I've only got a feeder of about 5 or 6 foot, and it works perfectly okay. The one thing I would say is that you do need to have an isolating transformer at the transceiver end, because at the transceiver end there will almost certainly be common mode currents flowing down, and common mode currents can cause problems, particularly when you're measuring VSWR. So I wouldn't bother about counterpoise, but I would say use a line isolator at the end. Now, a line isolator is just my favourite line isolator is an FT240 43 mix ferrite core, and wind, I don't know, that's 8 or 9 turns of coax around it. I have to confess, a lot of people frown on this, I have to confess that most of my HF antennas are fed with RG58. Now, people think, gracious me, RG58, gosh. Well, if you're using an end-fed half wave, you're probably not having a long run of coax. And most people using an end-fed half wave will be feeding it at the shack end, the house end, and therefore you haven't got a long length of coax anyway. It means say RG58 is very easy to wind around a ferrite core and create your line isolator. And I quite happily run 400 or 500 watts into RG58. Now, a lot of people throw their hands up and they say, oh, that's ridiculous. Well, call it ridiculous, call it what you will. It works quite happily. I've had no problems at all. So if you've got a small garden, I would say the end-fed half wave twisted around the garden is a good antenna to have. And it's getting more and more popular. And apart from the 49:1 unan, it's dead simple. You just need a length of wire. One of the other reasons for having a line isolator at the end is, or two things actually. You find that the VSWR meter can very easily be upset by common mode currents. And I remember discovering this quite a few years ago now. I was doing some VSWR measurements and they didn't make sense. It didn't make sense at all. And I noticed when I touched the out of the coax by the VSWR meter, the VSWR changed. If I put my hands on it, I got a better VSWR than if I didn't touch the back of the socket of the SWR meter. In other words, I was touching the end of the coax where the common mode current was flowing. And ever since then, I've always made a point of having a line isolator just before the coax goes into the transceiver, or the first thing it goes into. Very often the first thing it goes into is a VSWR meter. Make sure that you've got a line isolator there. Then you'll find that your VSWR readings make a lot more sense. The other thing about a line isolator is it can reduce noise. Now, we all suffer with noise, don't we? And it's never easy to resolve the issue of noise. Some people are fortunate. I'm not so bad at this location. I had a real problem at my previous location, but I also went up to the Shetland Islands, and often in the Shetland Islands, and I plugged an antenna into I had a little KX3 transceiver. I plugged my antenna into the KX3 and I thought, is it working? There was zero noise. But if you have a line isolator, then it can reduce the noise on the receiver. And I would say it's standard practice. Use a line isolator. You won't have any issues with VSWR measurements, and it may well help your noise. Another antenna which I really enjoy is the Doublet, multiband Doublet. I'm not quite sure where the Doublet name comes in, because the Doublet basically is a dipole, but it seems to be that if a dipole is fed with open wire or balanced line, it becomes known as a doublet. So a doublet, in my terms, is a half-wave antenna. Well, it's not a half-wave antenna. It can be a half-wave antenna, but it's fed in the centre with balanced line. Doublets are not really fussy about length and so forth. So again, it's another antenna to consider for a garden. Get out as much wire as you can. you haven't got to worry about whether it's a half wave or not. Just get as much wire as you can, break it in the middle, feed it with balanced line. 450 ohm ladder line is the one that is very popular. And also you can bend it round the garden. If, for example, you've got a garden that's 40 foot long and it's 20 foot wide, then you can have the main run of the doublet going down the garden 40 foot long. You could have another 10 or 15 feet bent at right angles or coming down towards the ground at one end and perhaps similar at the other end. You might be able to get about 70 odd feet of wire out. The advantage, the more wire you get, the better the antenna. Always bear in mind that the most important part of any dipole type of antenna is the center. That's where all the radiation comes from. The ends don't really radiate at all. All they serve to do is to bring it to resonance. And so try and get the center of the antenna in the clear as much as possible. If the ends go down into shrubs, well, it's not a real problem, except that you will find that in the winter, the antenna frequency probably rises a bit, and when you've got sap and all the leaves on the shrubs, it may lower the frequency, but you can cope with that. Particularly if it's a doublet, because a doublet is actually effectively resonated or matched at the end. Now, there's two ways of feeding a doublet. You can feed it with balanced line all the way back to the shack, and then have an antenna matching unit, and then that goes into the transceiver. You do need to have some form of antenna matching unit generally, because a doublet is fed with balanced line. There is another way of doing it. It's the way I prefer to do it, because it's the easy, and I always try to take the easy path, and that is to take the balance line back to the house, and then put a balun in it. Usually use a 1-to-1 or 4-to-1 balun. It doesn't seem to match over it. Connect a balun to it, and then have a short run of coax from that balun through a hole in the wall of the house into the transceiver. And I've always found that the current transceivers have got quite a range of matching unit. The matching unit's going to match quite a range. So basically, balance line back to a balun just outside the house or the shack, hole in the wall, length of coax 6-8 feet, something like that, straight into the transceiver. Chances are the antenna matching unit will match it okay. You will probably have a high VSWR or highish VSWR on that coax cable going through the wall to the balun. Frankly, the loss on that short length of coax is neither here nor there. Even if it's something like 4-to-1, you're not going to lose much at all on that length of coax. So, just to recap, a doublet, as long as you can get it, feed it in the middle, 450 ohm ladder line, back to outside the house, a balun, short length of coax cable, straight into the transceiver. Now, you may have a band where the transceiver matching unit won't cope. You can try altering the length of the coax. You may want to resort to an external matching unit. But my experience is that, I mean, I've got an FT710 now, which I've had for about a year, and I think it's the same antenna matching unit in the FTDX10 and the 101 series. Seems to have a very wide range, and I've had no problems at all with that. So that's the way I would connect your doublet. I love a doublet. It's nice. It's a quiet antenna, and it's multi-band. So give it some consideration. What about indoor antennas? Well, indoor antennas can work. The problem with an indoor antenna is noise. You don't know what noise you're going to get in the attic. So if you've got an indoor antenna, or you're thinking of putting an indoor antenna, that is one of the issues that you may want to consider, noise. The other thing, of course, is that if you've got various circuits in the loft, I don't know, I'm trying to give examples now. There's a lot of wiring in a loft or an attic. It could be that the RF starts to interfere with certain functions of certain items in the house. When I moved to a house about 20 years ago now, it was a small garden, And actually, I found that the best antenna again was a doublet. I had a doublet in there, and I think it was probably about 30, 35 foot long. It went across the sort of the eaves of the house, and then I dropped it down. I fed it with 450 ohm ladder line, and actually it's very easy to get that through the ceiling, because all you do is you just drill two very small holes in the ceiling. You can run the wire through there. In actual fact, I'm thinking about it, I think I used open wire feeder, and then I drilled two holes in the ceiling. Each side of the balance line went through there. That went into an antenna matching unit, because the internal matching units of the transceivers in those days weren't so good. That worked very well. And it was quite amazing that with this sort of 35 or 36 foot of wire, I could easily operate on 40 meters, even though it was nearly half the length of what it should be. It worked on 40 meters, worked well on the other bands, and it wasn't overly noisy actually. So if you're thinking of putting an indoor antenna in and you've got no alternative, give it a try. Don't forget that if you're in a house, the actual eaves are quite high. You're probably around about 20, 25 foot, something like that. So it's quite a respectable height. And of course, sometimes you haven't got an option. If you've got planning regulations which says you can't put an outside antenna in, fine. One of the modern things that we come against now is solar panels. I don't think solar panels are noisy in themselves, but I understand it's the power supplies that operate them are the ones that can be noisy. I don't know much about solar panels at all, but I do know that the actual installation can, in some cases, be noisy. Right, I'm going to tell you a story now, which you may have heard about on my YouTube channels, but I will repeat it because it's fascinating. I put up in my garden a half-size G5RV about 2 years ago, because I wanted to see what it worked like. Before that, I had an in-fed half-wave, and I thought, well, I'm going to see what half-size 5RV is, because 1 or 2 people have mentioned it, and my first antenna was a G5RV back in 1960. So I thought I'd put this up, and what I did, I got a fiberglass pole in the centre of my garden, or halfway down the garden, and I attached the feed point to the top of that fiberglass pole on the basis that that's where most of the radiation takes place. And then I had one end going to the house and the other end going down to the garden. The centre of the antenna was about 28 foot high, so it wasn't a half wave on 20 meters. It was a bit low on 20 meters. So when the textbook says it's got to be at least half wave high, it didn't meet that on 20 meters. Now a G5RV, the classic G5RV is 102 foot long, and it covers 80 through to 10 meters. When Louis Varney designed the G5RV, the walk bands didn't exist. So the 17 meter band and the 12 meter band didn't exist. Primarily, the full-size 5RV gives its best performance on 20 meters. It's 3 half-waves it plays, but it works on the other bands. On 80 meters is a bit short, but it still works. And basically, in very broad terms, it's 102 foot top. The balance line is around about 30 feet long, and then you terminate it in 50 ohm coax. Interestingly enough, when G5RV first came up with this idea, he had balanced line, open wire feeder going all the way back to the house. But then he modified it and came up with the idea of this 30 foot stub and then 50 ohm coax. And it gives you a reasonable match. Best matches on 20 meters. Well, the half size 5RV is what it says, half the size. And that fitted into my garden quite nicely. 52 foot. The balance line is 15, I can't remember the dimensions now, it's about 15 foot, 15 or 16 foot. And then I attach 50 ohm coax to it. At the point where I attach 50 ohm coax to it, I also have a one-to-one balun simply formed by, again, winding coax around. It's like a line isolator. And so this antenna is 28 foot high. And about 18 months ago now, I was less than 20 meters and I heard ZL3XDJ. And I thought, No, sorry, on 40 meters. I heard Brian ZL3XDJ on 40 meters. He wasn't particularly strong signal. This was on CW, and I thought, well, I'm going to give him a call, and I gave him a call, and to my surprise, he came back, and we had this contact on 40 meters, about 5 and 6 both ways, and then his signals faded out. Well, a few days later, I heard him on 20 meters. It was a stronger signal, so I called him again, and we had a QSO, and he dropped me an email and told me about himself and so forth, and we exchanged details. And then I heard him again about a week later, and we sort of struck up this sort of friendship, really. And I gathered that he was on the bands every day. Now, basically, what he was doing, he was using the grey zone um, sort of advantage. If it's dusk and dawn in opposite ends, you get this enhancement of signal. Now, it so happens that New Zealand is the antipodes of the UK, give or take about 200 miles. I think the actual antipodes is sort of just out to sea somewhere, but basically it doesn't really matter. ZL3XDJ is in the bottom of the South Island in New Zealand, and so he is basically the antipodes of the UK, and he is always on the air in the mornings, which is his evening time. And I then came up with this idea. What I did was, Brian usually puts out a CQ, and I got on CW. So I go onto reverse beacon, and I type in ZL3XDJ and let it sit there until I see him call CQ, and I know what frequency is on, and I can go back to him. I can also go onto QR. He uses the QRZ logbook, so I can go onto QRZ and see who is working. Well, we built up this sort of relationship, really. I work him at least once a week, and the signals are absolutely phenomenal. He is running he was running 200 watts to a vertical, ground-mounted vertical, and it was a good signal. It was easily 5 and 7, 5 and 8 in the morning. And then I said to him, look, what about raising the antenna above the ground? Because the verticals tend to work better with elevated radials. In other words, the radials above the ground, and you don't need so many of them. And he did that, and he said, this is amazing. He said, I reckon I've got an S point by raising the vertical above the ground. He said, I had 300 radials on the ground. He said, I've now got 4 radials. And he also added to that a reflector. Now, I've been doing some research on this, and I'm now 100% sure that the propagation each morning is using cordal hop. If you look at reverse beacon and you see his signal goes straight from New Zealand straight up to France, to a bit of Spain, and plonks itself quite nicely into the UK. He doesn't hit anywhere else. It's all the way from New Zealand up to UK and France, and it's talking to other stations and 1 or 2 people that have studied propagation. They agree it's cordal hop. It's so reliable. I can work Brian every morning if I so desire. Sometimes it's better than others. Cordal hop means to say that the signal gets trapped in the ionosphere and it pops out at the far end of the antipodes. Brian often gives me 5 and 9, 5 and 9 plus. It only lasts about 45 minutes, and we usually start off on 40 meters and perhaps migrate to 20 meters. Now, if you've got a pencil and paper, I suggest you write this down. Write his call sign down. It's ZL3XDJ. ZL3XDJ. Go on to reverse beacon in the morning and type his call sign in. You need to key on your search bar reverse beacon DX. That will take you straight to the reverse beacon page. You type in his call sign, press return, and what's happening now is the reverse beacon is looking for ZL3XDJ, and it's live. Once you've typed it in and leave it, you'll probably see that it's already called CQ. You'll probably see the chart showing the propagation. You'll see where it's calling CQ, and you can then tune to that frequency. and listen to him. Now he operates primarily CW, so if you can't read CW, you'll still hear the signal. He's on every morning without exception. Go into QRZ, type in ZL3XDJ, and then click where it says logbook, and you'll see the stations he's working. And if you go into QRZ and type his call sign in, you'll see all the stations he's been working. He's on every night, which is our morning. At the moment, it seems to be about 7:45 on 20 meters, about 7:45 in the morning. What will happen as we go into the spring, that time will probably get earlier. But check it out, it's fascinating. And the strength of his signal is quite phenomenal. He's now only running 100 watts. I persuaded him he had an FT480, which was getting old, and I persuaded him to get the FT710, which is Yaesu's budget price transceiver. It's a phenomenal transceiver. It's the only fully SDR HF transceiver that Yaesu make. The receiver is super. It's absolutely super, and I love it. So that's something you can check out. Right, I hope I haven't talked too long. Vertical antennas. Right, vertical antennas are the obvious way to go if you have got a small garden. There are some problems. The problem is noise, and I've explained this a few times in videos. Basically, noise is randomly polarized, but basically you can split the noise up into two forms: horizontally polarized noise and vertically polarized noise. And vertically polarized noise, basically, in the close proximity, is ground wave. Ground waves, unfortunately, travel much further, much more efficiently than horizontal waves in the close proximity. So it means to say the end result is that the predominant noise in your antenna, sort of 20 or 30 foot down the garden, is going to be vertically polarized. So basically, noise is picked up more on a vertical antenna than a horizontal antenna, and I reckon that on my garden there's about 2S points improvement with a horizontal antenna. Shouldn't write a vertical antenna off, because a vertical antenna can work very well. Just going back, let me cut back to Brian, by the way. I found that on my vertical antenna, I couldn't work Brian as well as I could on my horizontal antenna. Brian has got the exact opposite. He gets better signals on his vertical antenna than a horizontal antenna. And talking to one or two Americans, we've come up with a solution, and it's only a theory, we can't prove it, that the magnetic field in some parts of the world is vertically polarized, and in other parts of the world it's horizontally polarized. And it does seem to be that here in the UK, a vertical antenna doesn't work as well as a horizontal antenna. Brian finds exact difference, and a lot of people I've spoken to say, yes, I agree that the vertical antenna doesn't work as well as you think it does. Now, a vertical antenna's got low angle radiation. My antenna in the garden, the half size, hasn't got low angle radiation. And another theory we've got is if you're using cordal hop, you don't need ultra low angle radiation. Something like 25 or 30 degrees is fine. And it does seem to prove the point, certainly in the northern hemisphere and certainly in the UK, that you're better off with a horizontal antenna to work cordal hop than you are with a vertical antenna. If you find that that's not the case, let me know. So coming back to vertical antennas, yeah, they can be noisy, but they do work. Certainly, I would say if you can put a vertical antenna up, if you can possibly get the radials above the ground, then two things happen. You don't need so many radials, and you'll get better performance. You know, if you look back in Radcom or Shortwave magazine, you'll find that all vertical antennas in those days were actually elevated. We used to know them as the ground plane antenna. They could be sort of 15, 20 foot high on the side of the house with radials coming down. And that was the way we did them. It's only in more recent times that the idea has been put it on the ground. And the reason we put it on the ground is it's easy, isn't it? Put it on the ground. The trouble is you need quite a lot of radials to make it work. So that's my recommendation. What else have we got? Right, coming towards the end, I have got a FT710 and also an amplifier. And the reason I bought the amplifier was because I just wanted to see if I could get better signals, because if you've got a small garden, you can't put up an antenna. You can get some gain by using a linear amplifier. That gain, of course, doesn't repeat itself on receive side, but at least you get heard a bit better. I am still using this half size 5RV, and I've got a SWR on 15 meters about 4:1. Now, the internal matching unit of the 710 will match that, no problem at all. But as soon as I have a linear amplifier, I can't use the ATU in the transceiver. So what I did was I opted for a valve amplifier. And the reason I opted for a valve amplifier is because a valve amplifier has got what we call a pi network in the output. And a pi network is basically an antenna matching unit, which will quite happily match 4:1. So the disadvantage of a valve amplifier is you have to wait 3 or 4 minutes for it to warm up. But the advantage is you don't have to have an external antenna matching unit. If I had a solid state amplifier, I would also have to have an antenna matching unit to match my half size 5RV. So that's the reason why I went for the valve amplifier. Okay, so I don't want to talk on too long. I'm sure there'll be some questions. Basically, that's my take on the HF antenna for small gardens. Yes, you can operate HF for small gardens. Treat it as a challenge. Don't be frightened to experiment. Get some wire out. The end-fed half-wave is certainly the easiest antenna to get going, and it doesn't cost much apart from the 49:1 unan. And if you key in 49:1 unan on my video channel, I'll show you how to make one. It's quite simple. Provided you've got a ferrite core, you can do it quite simply. It's not technically very difficult at all to make one. And also the video channel, by the way, is just me. I do everything, the editing, the photography, the talking, and so forth. Generally speaking, get some good comments, and there's always somebody who will sort of knock you for something or other, and they think, oh, okay, did you realise you got 2 E's in that word? And they're probably right. But basically, one of the good things about the video channel is, and I do encourage it, is people make comments. People make comments about the video I've put out, and some of those comments contain some useful information. So if you're looking at the channel, have a look at the comments. Some of them are quite interesting. Also, going back to QRZ, look at QRZ quite regularly. If you work a station on the handbands and you key in the call sign, have a look at the QRZ page, because sometimes there's some interesting technical stuff there. I've picked up 1 or 2 interesting things by just be reading these stations' comments. And I worked a station in Belgium last week on CW, and he was 95 years old. I thought, gracious me, I wish my CW was as good as his. So there we are. I have a theory, that if you, I'm not trying to convert you to CW, but I have a theory, that if you operate CW, it keeps your brain active. There's no 2 ways about it. If you're operating CW, you really got to work at it sometimes. And sometimes the station's sending CW fairly fast. You can't write it down. So I try to get on the air perhaps at least sort of 4 or 5 times a week on CW, just to keep it up, because it is fascinating. And if some people say, no, I don't like CW, and that's a choice. But I got this theory that if you operate CW, it just keeps your brain going. So there we are. And talking about age and brains and so forth, a couple of weeks' time I should be 82 years old. So there we are. Okay, thanks for your support. So the shop, thanks for your support in this channel. I'm sure you've got some questions. So if you'd like to open up the audio, whatever you do, I don't know. By the way, I found this very easy to do on the WebEx. I found it okay. I thought it was going to be a bit frightening, but now I've got onto it okay. So there we are. That's my take on HF antennas in small gardens.
I've always used a G5RV half size, and I found it to be a great antenna. Now, in the last 2 or 3 years, I've always started to wind my own toroids. I've started with a T200-2 toroid. Then I've gone on to the smaller T130-2 toroid, which I found to be a little bit less noisy. And now I'm looking at the T240-43. Which is your best toroid you would use if you was going to make your own long wire?
Well, I think the general opinion has always been that the 240-43 is a good toroid, because it's for a start, it's bigger, so you can put windings around it easier. I've used nothing else. I've always used 240-43, and if you look at a lot of articles covering that sort of thing, the 240-43 seems to be the favourite. So I would go 240-43.
And how many turns would you normally put on that, Peter?
We're talking about a line isolator, are we?
Yes.
Do you know, I don't think it matters. A lot of people say, oh, you'd have this and that. I mean, I use RG58, and probably I put about 8 or 9 turns on. I don't think it's that critical, to be honest. I really don't. Yeah. You know, you get people say, oh, you know, you use so many turns for this band and that band. I mean, bear in mind that we use that for a wideband transformer for 49-1. It's got a wide frequency range. So why has it got a wide frequency range when used as a line isolator? 8, 9 turns, it's not critical.
No,
it's not critical.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, thanks for coming, Pete. Yeah, really enjoy your videos. Yeah, got the last talk I did, I think I borrowed quite excessively from them, actually. Just a question, with the end-fed half-wave, if the length of it is odd multiples of a quarter wave, so for example, it's three quarters of a wave length for the band that you're using, is there a risk of there's stuff coming down the braid if there's not a counterpoise? That's the first.
Well, basically, it wouldn't be an odd number of quarter waves, because it's basically it's a half wave antenna on the lowest band, so it'll be multiples of a half wave.
If you use the mainstream bands.
Yeah, let's give you an example. Let's say you got a half wave of 40 meters, which means to say I'm going to work in old money. It's 66 foot long or something like that, and you will get a reasonable VSWR. You tend to find that the VSWR or the harmonics are not quite in line. As you go higher in frequency, you'll find that it gets slightly out. But basically, to get a good match, I think what you're saying is, can you operate it on bands where it's not a half? For example, 66 foot of wire is 2 half waves on 20 meters. So you've got a low VSWR. Can you operate it on 17 meters where it's no longer a half wave? It's not an exact number of quarter waves, but it's certainly not anywhere near a half wave. The answer is basically yes, you can. The thing you've got to be careful of is power. I'm not quite sure what the power handling is, because as soon as you've got a mismatch there, because what will happen is that you won't have a high impedance, so you'll have a slightly lower impedance, so you've got a bit of a mismatch. I have frequently operated on 17 meters with an antenna such as that, and it works. But you do have a VSWR on there. You'll have something like 3 or 4 to 1 VSWR. Provided your transceiver will match it, or your internal matching unit will match it, then fine, give it a whirl and it'll probably work. You'll get some losses there, but basically, at least it works. You know, some people say, can you do this, can you do that? You can do a lot of things with antennas. You can operate on bands that are not, when it's not resonant, and you get a VSWR of 3.5, 4 to 1. And you're going to get losses there, but it works. I mean, I've worked Brian a couple of times on 17 meters. Now my half-size 5RV is not really good on 17 meters. I've got a loss, but it works. Now, one of the things we're blessed with is the modern HF transceivers now, particularly the ones from Yaesu, seem to match a very wide range of impedances. And provided that it matches, it means to say at least you've got all the power going out into the feed line. You're still going to get losses. But going back sort of 10 or 15 years, the transceiver wouldn't like that VSWR, so it started to throttle back. So two things happened. First of all, you weren't getting full power, you're getting 50 watts or 30 watts because the transceiver throttled back. It didn't like the match. And then, of course, you've got loss in the coax because of the VSWR. So we are blessed now with being able to get full power, generally speaking, into the antenna.
Peter, thanks for the talk. Actually, in fact, I've seen you before at the club many years ago. Actually, in fact, I could remember once or yeah.
I had hair then.
Right, yes. I was just going to say, in fact, I use a full-size G5 RV, which means it tunes down to 80 meters. And I find that that's a very nice aerial for us. It's a fair. You've got to have a fair-sized back garden for it, but you can bend the ends around a bit, you know, to sort of, if you like, fit it in. I have it about 28 feet, and I find that's quite all right actually for my use. It's an inverted V,
Right.
with the ends above the ground. And I think the worst SWR I get, in fact, on all the bands on that is about 2.5.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's particularly good, and and the FT5K, which I've got the internal tuner, will tune it on any of the bands that I use between 80 and 10. Yeah.
Yeah. Have we got any CW operators?
After a fashion.
Yeah. Do listen out. Do listen out for Brian.
I was going to say, actually, I'm going to have a listen for that guy. Actually, in fact, that's very interesting. That I've written all the details that you gave us down for that. Yeah,
I think he seems to be blessed with. He's on the South Island. He's right to the bottom of the South Island. He's about half a mile from the coast.
Right.
I can honestly say that I've listened on the bands, and he comes through, and I think, well, if I'm hearing him, why I can't hear any other ZLs? But for whatever reason, he's there. He's there every morning. But you need to go onto reverse beacon just to see where he's operating on.
Right. Yes.
But yeah, he's on. Nice guy. And if you do happen to work him, he's a nice guy. He is actually an XG, by the way. He was G4XDJ. Now I've got an idea he may have come from your area.
Nigel, can you help there, or Tony?
I think listening to his accent, he's probably from the northeast somewhere, because I think he's like Yorkshire stroke northeast. But talking to Brian, and I think some of the others might comment on this one. We have a member not too well in the general area down there, which is and trying to remember his call sign. It's Barry, isn't it? Victor Kilo 3 Bravo Juliet, who's in the Sydney area, and I'm aware that he's another guy that tends to try and work back into the UK as much as possible, because his previous call sign is G3PEK and operating from this area. So there's another chap to listen out for, should we say?
Yeah.
But I wonder if there's any other questions, please. Tom, I mean, perhaps talking to Tom, I mean, you use your G5RV on top band, did you not?
I have done, yeah. Well, basically speaking, I do it on top band. I just actually couple the ends together and center feed it actually, and I put a bit of random wire down in the garden actually, Jack, as a bit of a counterpoise. It does seem to help a bit actually, keep some of the RF out of the shack, but it will actually tune, and you can it radiates all right actually on top band. So
I mean that's I think Louis Varney said that, you know, for 160 meters, strap the feeder.
That's right. Just strap it right at the bottom of where the ladder line comes down. Just couple it together. Incidentally, the G5RV that I use, in fact, it's got 29 feet of open wire coming down and 45 feet of coax. That's the particular one that I use. Yeah, I think there's a number of variations on that.
Is ZS6 BKW one, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes.
It's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting, really, because people have tried to get the measurement so you get a low VSWR on various bands, but you get it. If you get it on one, it goes up on the other.
Correct.
basically, it's a doublet. It's a doublet of a particular.
That's right.
It's a doublet. You know.
Yeah.
You are right, though. Just pick you up on that. That you do need a counterpoise if you're going to strap the feeder on 160 meters.
Yeah. Definitely.
The end-fed half-wave with the 49-to-1 unun doesn't actually need any counterpoise. But if you're feeding an antenna directly, and feeding it directly without a transformer, basically you do need a counterpoise.
It's quite interesting actually. There's a friend of mine, G0LZL, actually, it doesn't live too far from here, And we had great fun actually with our full-size G5 RVs. David made a G5 RV. He thought I paid too much for mine. So basically, he cobbled his own one together, in fact, and brought it. And he says the damn thing doesn't work on any bands. It's high SWR on every band. It won't tune. We put the meter on it. Oh yes, the dips were there. It was just not on the amateur bands. They were miles off. And in fact, the difference was I was using the narrower down feeder. The stuff. It's about what? It's about 1.5 centimeter or so. And there's the wide stuff. It's about about that much actually. The wider stuff, the 450 ohm. And he was using, I think, I was using the 150 ohm stuff, and he was using 450. And in actual fact, the thing that seemed to make all the difference was actually the actual resistance of the actual the ladder line.
Yeah. You will find. I mean, it's interesting the fact that if you use RG58. And it's, I don't know, let's say you've got an 80-foot feeder, RG58, and you replace it with RG213, which is thicker coax. The VSWR, the effective VSWR will actually go up because you've got less loss. So you actually find the VSWR goes up, and sometimes you don't get you can't match it so well because, ironically, if you've got lossy coax, it creates a match. It creates a better match because you're feeding a bit of it into like a sort of a leaky load.
The stuff I use is Mini 8 actually on mine.
I mean, people sort of say, "What do you use?" I say, "I'm using RG58." On HF, well, why not? You use RG58 for the feeder in the HF mobile antenna system.
That's right.
And I run a linear and still run the linear through RG58.
Right.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this evening. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pete.
Okay, well, thank you guys for inviting me. Thanks for listening. Thanks for staying awake. It's good to know that you stayed awake. I do appreciate your support. I hope you'll continue to support, the company, because we do. Well, I've been doing it for 52 years.
Thank you very
enjoy
much.
the rest of the evening, what you do, and we may see you later in the year.
Oh, Peter, before you go, I had one question, and that was, you spoke quite a bit about. I'm sorry. I'm just throwing this one in as a late one. You spoke quite a bit about the half-size G5 RV, and in fact, you talked about starting at 40 meters, 40, 20, 15, 10, etc. But in actual fact, once upon a time in the club, in fact, we actually put coils on the end of a half-size RV to actually give us the 80 meters as well. Have you ever tried anything with that? That's just I'm sorry for keeping you.
I haven't tried it on the half size of a V. I have actually used those coils, but it works well. It works well. You can. You're quite right. I forgot to mention that. I think we sell the coils actually.
Right.
Put the coils on the. I'm trying to think of the value. I think it's about 120 microhenry, something like that.
I can remember making coils actually. In fact, and we used a meter to measure them. We wound them, in fact, and checked them up with an impedance meter.
Somewhere on our website. I must try that. I've forgotten about those actually. I think we still sell them actually. But put the coils on the end and probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 foot of wire
on the end. Yes, that's right.
Down. Good idea.
Thank you very much, Peter. I won't keep you any longer. That's
Thank you, Peter. That was an excellent talk, excellent presentation, and thank you very much for answering all the questions there. And as Neil says, hopefully we'll see you further down in the year. But all the best from Stockport up in the frozen north to all those people who are in various different parts of the world. And we'll wish you best M3s and see you further down the log, as they say.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks,
Thank you
Peter.
very much.
Take care.
Listen out for Brian. Okay, see ya. Cheers.
See you then.